Welcome to Talmudic Treasures. Today we're learning Ketubot page 108, which discusses a concept that we've discussed before, but is brought down specifically on this page as its primary source, namely that when it comes to a man who has a lot of money and that individual dies, so we say that the law is that the boys are the ones that inherit. However, the girls receive mazonos, they receive food. That doesn't just mean a couple of dollars, of course. This is a significant amount of money, as we're dealing with young children, potentially, and therefore the amount of food that they will need to sustain themselves for many, many years, again, is really a significant amount of money. And therefore, it then tells us, what if he doesn't have a lot of money? Then what do we do? So we say that the girls will still get their food. They still get the mazonos. But the boys, who usually get potentially a much larger inheritance, will get nothing. Instead, we say, let the boys knock on doors if they need to beg for food, to be able to survive, but we would rather not do that for the women. So on this, there is a question that is posed by Admon, and he says, it doesn't make any sense. If the boys, clearly the ones that get the bulk of this inheritance, when there is, again, a lot of money to go around, so doesn't it make sense that if there's not a lot, that they should also get? It's clear the fact that if there's a lot of money, that the boys are the ones that get, again, the majority of all that money. So certainly they should not be forsaken and ignored when there's not a lot of money. And therefore, one would potentially suggest, based on that thought, that really we should reverse this ruling, and that the boys should get even when there is not a lot to go around, and maybe not the women, not the daughters. In fact, the Talmud here tells us that Rabbi Gamliel said, you know what? I see your point of logic. Now, the difficulty is that typically, whenever Rabbi Gamliel says that I hear what you're saying, you have a very valid point, that usually means that the law is like that statement. And the problem is that, in fact, we know that that's not the case. So how do we understand this? So the commentator Tosfos on this page tells us that the reality is that there is no reversal of this rule. All Rabbi Gamliel is saying is, you have a good point. It's a very interesting point that you're presenting. I understand where you're coming from. But at the end of the day, it doesn't make any difference. At the end of the day, the women are going to be the ones, the girls are going to be the ones that will receive their mazonos, their food, and the boys, again, will not receive anything if there's not a lot of money to go around. Rather, again, unfortunately, they're going to have to figure it out on their own, how to be able to survive and to function, to live, but they're not going to be able to get anything. So we see from here a very interesting concept. Even though the great Rabbi Gamliel says, you know what, you have a very, very valid point. It's a good point. That does not necessarily mean that that automatically changes things, that the rules automatically change. And that perhaps could also be derived in life. There are some times when a person can look at certain laws and rules and say, you know what, this doesn't seem logical. And you may actually present yourself in a very clear manner that you're actually saying something which makes sense, to perhaps show that the law is not necessarily exactly the way it perhaps should be. But at the end of the day, the law is the law, and the rule is the ruling. So even though it's true, you may have an interesting point to present, don't forget one other detail. There's probably another way of looking at it. There's probably something that you have presented that is not the entire picture. And of course, in this situation, we have to recognize the sensitivity of these young girls, that we do not want them walking all over the street begging for food. Obviously, we wouldn't want that for the boys either. However, at least then, it was certainly something which was much more difficult and perhaps even more dangerous for young girls to be walking around randomly trying to find food. And therefore, again, we see from here a very important concept. Just because you have a particular way of thinking does not necessarily mean that is the correct way. It's important for us to understand the entire picture and then possibly realize that your position, although it seems logical, may not be the conclusion.